Israel is being accused of genocide and is continually violating international law. Condemnation after condemnation by the UN, by many world leaders and by human rights organizations. Why does that happen? What is true about the allegations against Israel? Is Israel indeed such a notorious violator of international law? And why is Hamas not on trial in the international legal arena? Natasha Hausdorff, a barrister in London, is specialized on this subject. Natasha Hausdorff, thank you for being in our show. Already for years, Israel is being accused of breaching international law, of committing war crimes. What are the exact accusations against Israel?
Well, I'm afraid the accusations are numerous and they are growing, it seems, on a daily basis. So we probably don't have to have the opportunity to go through all of them. But the most recent accusations focus on this false allegation of genocide. That is unfortunately a modern manifestation of the ancient blood libels, and it has gained currency. It is perhaps as widely believed now as the ancient blood libels were in the Middle Ages. The real grotesque aspect of the allegation of genocide against Israel isn't just that it's an inversion of international law and based on utterly false allegations with respect to the factual basis, but it's also an instance of blaming the victims of real genocide for the actions that were perpetrated against them.
You're linking the accusation of genocide to the blood libels referring to the fact that the Jews are blamed for all the bad things that happened during, for example, the Middle Ages. But is it reasonable to make this connection? Because people are genuinely concerned about the situation of the Palestinian people in Gaza, and they are saying that Israel is acting too fiercely, is making too many victims. So what would be your answer to that?
I think anyone who is genuinely concerned, as I am, of the fate of ordinary innocent Palestinians in the Gaza Strip should be advocating for the proper enforcement of international law and, for example, the obligation that Egypt has under the African Union Convention on Refugees, which it acceded to in 1980, the responsibility it has to facilitate the passage of genuine refugees under the definition of that convention, any individuals fleeing civil disorder. Applying the proper international law that Egypt has signed up to Egypt in this instance would facilitate the evacuation of Palestinian civilians, the provision of humanitarian assistance on the other side of the Gaza border in the Sinai, in Egyptian Rafah, so that aid isn't diverted to Hamas. There are very simple, straightforward measures that can be taken that should have been taken in October of last year for the protection of Palestinian civilians. But they weren't taken. And what the situation that has developed is very simply that Israel has undertaken the responsibility of protecting Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip, protecting them also from Hamas attacks, because they have been shooting Palestinian civilians that have sought to flee because Hamas so desperately wants to hang on to its human shields. And the very core of this needs to be understood. This is Hamas's aim, to seek to generate Palestinian civilian casualties, which Israel has been doing its utmost to prevent, and to do so in order to generate international pressure on Israel, because that is Hamas's only hope of survival, to generate both the factual misstatements and false allegations, but also those in international law, to generate pressure on Israel to cease its lawful self-defense against Hamas so that Hamas can survive this operation, this war, which has been called Iron Swords. And that spells disaster, not just for Israel, but for all Western liberal democratic interests around the world. Because, of course, we need to understand that what starts with Israel in this respect is not intended to end with Israel. The aims of these Islamist fundamentalist groups sponsored by Iran have been made very clear.
Yeah, just focusing on the allegation of genocide, because it's not only Hamas who is saying that Israel is committing genocide. Many governments are saying it, and even there is a court case in the International Court of Justice where the highest court existing on earth is making a judgment at this moment about this matter. So it's. I
Yes.
can imagine it's not easy to say it's genocide or it's not genocide. So what are the balances? What are the things that are being balanced in this discussion?
Well, it should be pretty easy and pretty straightforward. But unfortunately, we have a series of misrepresentations, including over what the International Court of Justice has in fact said so far. Because the January order that the court gave in terms of the provisional measures that South Africa was seeking by levying this false allegation against Israel, the court was very clear in terms of its ruling on plausibility. It considered the allegations that South Africa was raising and whether they plausibly fell under the Genocide Convention. There has been no assessment of the merits of this case and no assessment of whether or not Israel is committing a genocide here. And that is something that has been consistently, unfortunately, misrepresented in terms of what the court itself has ruled. Subsequent to that, of course, we've got all of the discussion in the international media and everything that South Africa presented to the court, which is essentially, unfortunately, a propaganda exercise in promoting this libel against Israel. On the other side of that, we have, not only the aspects of the intention to commit genocide, which is a critical factor of this allegation. That is important to highlight. It is an intention to destroy a group in whole or in part. This is wholly inapplicable to Israel's measured self-defense operation, where the highest standards of international humanitarian law have been applied. And added to that, we have the humanitarian initiatives that Israel has been pursuing. With respect to the operation in Gaza, as with other aspects of situations of armed conflict, there is a department, a unit of the Israeli Defense Forces called Kogat, whose only purpose is to provide for the humanitarian assistance of civilians caught up in armed conflict. And the documentation of the efforts and the initiative that Kogat has been making with respect to humanitarian aid and the protection of civilians in the Gaza Strip is clear, and it is updated on a daily basis. So, the facts in that respect speak for themselves.
Right. So, but talking about the humanitarian aid that Kogat is bringing into Gaza, all the charities that are working in Gaza, the organizations that are helping the civilians there, they say it's not enough. They say people are dying there, they're starving there, and Israel is using starvation as a weapon in the war. What would be your answer to that?
It's unfortunate that these aid organizations seem to be seeking to cover up their own failings by blaming Israel. It is, again, a matter of public record that the capacity that Israel has just across the two crossings, the Kerem Shalom crossing and the Nitzana crossing, the capacity that Israel has to check aid, to make sure that there are not weapons being smuggled through, to make sure that there are not items that Hamas will use for its terror initiative. Israel's capacity to check aid stands at some 44 lorries of aid an hour. That is significantly in excess of what the international community is putting through. And we do also have repeated daily updates from Kogat as to the amount of aid that is piling up on the other side, so inside Gaza, after Israeli checks, that has yet to be distributed by UN organizations and other humanitarian organizations on the ground. Now, we understand the difficulties, the practical difficulties associated with the distribution of that aid. Hamas is diverting it. There are other criminal gangs that have been also, it seems, stealing aid. The ability of UN and other humanitarian organizations to distribute it in the context of a war zone where there is still intense fighting between Hamas and the IDF taking place is clearly extremely problematic. And we saw only a couple of days ago now the very tragic consequences of what can happen in war, where a mistaken identification resulted in the World Central Kitchen aid workers and those security employees who were in losing their lives.
Exactly. Talking about these aid workers that were killed, Israel admitted that they were mistakenly hit by an Israeli airstrike, and they apologized for that. But what could be the consequences of this terrible incident for Israel?
But it is a real tragedy. The manner in which this tragedy is being weaponized against Israel is shocking, deeply shocking, because friendly fire incidents are an unfortunate reality of warfare. They have existed throughout the armed conflict, of course, in the context of the war against terror, the Allied forces. There are repeated incidences of US strikes that were mistaken, that killed aid workers. Of course, there are incidences, even from the British Army's perspective, of its fighting in the Falklands, and incidences of friendly fire in a completely different context to the Gaza Strip, where there wasn't the same densely populated area in which a terrorist organization was using civilians as human shields and firing upon the Israeli Defense Forces as they are in Gaza from within schools, hospitals, mosques, and civilian residential homes. In all of those contexts, this tragic incident, and it is being investigated by the IDF because there are stringent measures in place to seek to prevent things like this from happening. And in the context of this drawn out conflict over 6 months, the incidences of tragic events like this have been remarkably low. Any of them, of course, need to be gotten to the bottom of. But in the context, as I say, of other incidences of law-abiding armies seeking to do their utmost to target strikes and to make sure that civilians and aid workers are protected, the way that this has been misrepresented by the international press and even by some lawyers over the last few days is extremely worrying, because it again serves the interests of the Hamas terror organization.
Let's talk about the casualty figures in Gaza. We see them every day on the news that now more than 32,000 Palestinians were killed. 70% of them are women and children, and the number of children is estimated as around 13,000 during the course of the war, almost 6 months now. These numbers are enormous. So how reliable are they?
They are not reliable. There has already been substantial analysis just on the figures themselves and the uniform fashion in which they have been increased by Hamas on a daily basis. It's critical to understand that these are figures put out by the Hamas terror organization. The idea that the international media would take figures put out by Al-Qaeda or ISIS as having any credibility to them is simply not workable, and yet we see them reporting these figures mostly without qualification. The other aspects of the unreliability of these figures are that they make no distinction between civilians and combatants. So neither in their fighting in life nor in death, unfortunately, do Hamas distinguish between the terrorist fighters and civilian casualties. We also don't know how these people are said to have died. Quite apart from the analysis of the naturally occurring deaths quite outside of the conflict situation that we're seeing, we also have evidence that has been accepted by the Americans also of Hamas targeting its own civilians, shooting fleeing Palestinian civilians, bombing fleeing civilian convoys, those civilians seeking to follow the instructions of the Israeli Defense Forces and evacuate areas where there will be intense fighting because of the Hamas terror infrastructure. And we have also seen Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad rockets that were fired with the intention of killing Israeli civilians, in fact falling short in the Gaza Strip and killing Palestinian civilians indiscriminately there. So when one takes all of these factors into consideration, No, one cannot trust the numbers, especially in the absence of that context. But even if you were to put all of that aside and compare the Israeli record of civilian to combatant casualty numbers, and even based on the Hamas figures against the some 15,000 terrorists that Israel has identified that it has killed, then we're looking at a civilian to combatant ratio. It's terrible to reduce it to ratios and numbers of this sort, but in the context of armed conflict, this is the only way that one can have any sense of comparison. So the ratio that the Prime Minister put out was that it was less than 1 to 1. Um, Other analysis suggests 1.6 or 1.5 to 1, 1.5 civilians to every one combatant. That sounds terrible, but when one compares it with the global average that the United Nations puts out, which is 9 civilians to every one combatant, and when one compares it with the averages of the Allied forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, which is between 3 to 1 and 5 to 1, then a 1 to 1 average is completely unprecedented. And in the context of the intense fighting and the urban armed conflict and Hamas's terror infrastructure, which is embedded in civilian areas and uses civilians as human shields, it is quite remarkable that Israel has been able to achieve such a low casualty ratio amongst civilians. And it is testament to the extraordinary measures, the unprecedented measures that Israel takes to prevent civilian casualties. What we saw in the context of the World Central Kitchen is a tragic mistake, an error, and an accident as a result of a very intense situation. Armed conflict, any sort of war, is the most chaotic environment anyone could possibly imagine. And in those circumstances, tragic mistakes happen. But the overall assessment of Israel's ability to keep civilian casualties down in Gaza is remarkable and, as I say, unprecedented in the history of warfare.
So what you're describing is actually the proportionality that is so often discussed in the media, accusing Israel of being disproportional in their reaction. So this proportionality, why do you think then, if you describe it like this, like the ratio 5 civilians to 1 fighter, and that ratio in this conflict is much lower, 1 to 1, so why is there such a focus on what Israel is doing, and why are the accusations there that Israel is being disproportional in their reaction?
Well, it's really important to understand that the assessment of proportionality is not on the basis of comparing casualty figures at all. And that is another major misrepresentation, especially in the way that this conflict is being covered by the international media. That would be macabre and reprehensible, and it would also simply encourage Hamas to keep trying to drive up the number of civilian casualties that it is inflicting on the civilians in the Gaza Strip. International law does not work on the basis of an effects-based analysis. It is based on intention. So it is completely inappropriate to suggest that a comparison of the casualty figures assists with an assessment of proportionality. Proportionality under the law of armed conflict is about the intention of the military commanders making an assessment and weighing up the military advantage of any particular strike against the anticipated civilian collateral damage. Now, it's critical to understand in that context, the law of armed conflict anticipates and accepts that there will inevitably be collateral damage in the context of fighting an enemy. That's even before you get to the scenario in which Hamas is using this in terms of driving up civilian casualties as a tactic of its own warfare. But in that context, Israel has a track record not just of applying the law of armed conflict and proportionality in particular, but going way above the requirements of international humanitarian law. And the assessment that it conducts on a strike-by-strike basis, where these targets are approved in advance by military lawyers, and where every single army commander has the responsibility to ensure that the IDF code of ethics of preventing civilian casualties, of prizing life giving it the highest value, that every IDF commander is in a position to call off a strike if there are civilians in the vicinity, and if that proportionality analysis becomes disproportionate in
Right.
their opinion.
Yeah, we're almost coming to a conclusion. So my question is, Israel is being brought before the International Court of Justice. Why not Hamas?
Well, Hamas is not a state, and they are simply not held, unfortunately, to international law. That is why their very modus operandi is to break every aspect of the law of armed conflict and international law in their fight to eradicate the state of Israel. The reason that Israel has been brought before the International Court of Justice is, in fact, a technical one, and that is why South Africa advanced this false, malicious allegation of genocide. It provides a hook to bring Israel to the court because Israel is a signatory to the Convention on the Prevention and the Punishment of Genocide. And that is the true motivation for the allegation. Well, I would say that there are two parts to it. Part one is the technical hook that it has afforded South Africa to actually bring this case. But the other aspect of this is the propaganda factor. The allegation of genocide is so heinous, and it is the only real way in which to understand it is in the context of this ancient blood libel, which accused Christians of Jews of killing Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals. The allegation of Israel intentionally killing civilians and seeking to commit genocide is just as fallacious, and it has certainly changed the debate and changed the manner of in which reasonable people, it seems, are able to discuss the important developments that are happening in Gaza, and it has assisted Hamas in weaponizing international law and misrepresenting it and abusing it vis-a-vis Israel to seek to win. And it wins very simply by surviving. If Israel is not able to destroy Hamas and to prevent it from ever seeking to commit the 7th of October again, and critically to free the hostages, 134 of them are still being kept by Hamas, then Hamas will have won. And that spells, as I indicated earlier, very bad news, not just for Israel, but also for the interests in the West that Hamas and other Iranian proxies are seeking to do harm to.
Yeah, because what could the international community, according to you, what could they do to put pressure on Hamas to release the hostages that are still in Gaza?
I think they could be doing an awful lot more, not least because Qatar clearly has leverage over the Hamas leadership. And so these diplomatic games that have been played with people's lives at stake are pretty despicable. But clearly the international community can be doing more to support Israel, an ally of the West that is fighting the fight of the West in the Middle East, and by certainly not giving credence to the false allegations and the misrepresentations of international law that are being used to seek to delegitimize Israel and to seek to stop it from being able to exercise its rights of self-defense.
Natasha Hausdorff, thank you very much for coming in our studio.
It's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Keep yourself up to date about the news in Israel by following our website c4israel.org. Thank you for watching and goodbye.